Good afternoon. My name is Will Pomerantz. I'm Deputy Director here at the Kennan Institute, and welcome to our noontime discussion. Before we get started, just a brief word about some upcoming events here at the Kennan Institute in what has been a very busy November. This Wednesday, November 10th, we will have a seminar here at the Woodrow Wilson Center co-sponsored by the History and Public Policy Program with Timothy Snyder, Professor of History at Yale, and we will be discussing his new book, Bloodlands, Europe Between Hitler and Stalin. On Monday, November 15th, we'll have a noon discussion with Nicholas Eberstadt at the American Enterprise Institute, and he'll be talking about Russia's peacetime demographic crisis. On Monday, November 22nd, we'll have a noontime discussion with Pata Sikorishvili, who is the founder and artistic director of Sonetic Theater, and he will be discussing the Master and Margarita staging for a post-Cold War generation. And finally, on Monday, November 29th, we'll have a noon discussion with Stephen Cohen talking about his new book, The Victims Return, Survivors of the Gulag After Stalin. Oh, fantastic. I've just been informed of an important promotion from our speaker today, John Steinberg. He is currently a professor at Georgia Southern University. He did his graduate training at Ohio State University, where he received his Ph.D. He is the author of numerous articles and collected volumes. He's also a recognized, as I should say, leader in the profession. He co-organized a major respective on the Russo-Japanese War, and he is one of the co-leaders in an ongoing project on Russia's Great War and Revolution, 1914 to 24. We're here today to talk about John's new book, which is published by the Woodrow Wilson Center Press and Johns Hopkins University. It is All the Tsars' Men, Russia's General Staff, and the Fate of the Empire, 1898 to 1914. There are copies on sale outside, and John's informed me that he's quite happy to autograph any of them as you wish. So it's our great pleasure to welcome back John Steinberg. John, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So where do you begin on launching your book? I think the most common thought of any scholar who's worked forever on a project is to launch it right out the window. However, today I'm going to treat you to kind of like a synopsis in the hope that maybe you'll be interested in, maybe not buy it, but read it. So when I was thinking about what I wanted to say, I thought, how did I end up doing this? Why this topic? Why these guys right here, if you can see them? And it really does go back to when I was working on a master's thesis at the University of Kansas on the Kornilov Revolt, an event in the Revolution, 1917. I'm assuming this crowd knows all about the Kornilov Revolt, or at least has heard of it. No? Well, you'll have to come to my lectures down in Statesboro, Georgia next semester. I'll bring you up to speed. This is an event in the Revolution where a general staff officer, a general in the Imperial Army in the midst of World War I, tries to stop the chaos in Petrograd and seize control. It's defeated, and I would argue it opens the door for the Bolsheviks to seize power, about 2 months later. And I did a thesis on this, and at the end of the thesis I came to the conclusion that to understand why the Tsarist military elite did not stop the leftward drift of the revolution in 1917, we really needed to understand who these guys were. So I packed up my suitcase and I went to Ohio State, where there was a gentleman there at the time. His name was Alan Wildman. He had just published a book on the Great Soldiers' Revolt, of which title I can't remember at this moment. It might be Soldiers in Revolt. It's the end of the Imperial Russian Army. And said to him, I wanted to write a dissertation, and the title of it was going to be Military Professionals and Professionalism in Late Imperial Russia. And I immediately had a mentor who was completely enthused with the project. And this really does grow out of this body of research, with one major hiccup, and that was I wrote my dissertation, and then 3 days later the archives opened up. Well, not exactly 3 days later, but within a matter of months, and I really had to go back to ground zero and start all over again. So, to get at this question of military professionalism in late imperial Russia, I focused on three central themes. And the themes were the education, the training, and the performance of the Imperial Russian Army, focusing specifically on general staff officers. And I had to choose some type of chronological limit, and this was a really, really difficult decision, because as any good historian knows, history just does not stop and begin with this date or that date, but you need some type of signpost, some point of reference. And I ended up with the year 1898, because at the beginning of that year, an individual named Kuropatkin was named commander-in-chief, or actually he was named war minister in 1898. He becomes commander-in-chief of the operational army in 1904. And Kuropatkin becomes a central figure in my story, largely because arguably he is the first general staff officer to reach the pinnacle of power, that of war minister, who has benefited directly from the military reforms that were enacted by Dmitry Milyutin during the Age of Great Reform. Now, you see, this I always think of the old Laurel and Hardy, where Hardy would step into a seemingly innocent puddle and then be up to his chin. Because, the first step is, well, you have to understand the Milyutin reforms. And now you've just taken off another couple generations of history that you have to add to it. But they are fundamental to the rise of these military professionals who will lead the empire at the beginning of the 20th century. Kuropatkin is the first one who benefits directly from educational reforms and, shall we say, training reforms that have been enacted between the 1860s and the 1890s. And so I decided to focus on the year 1898 as the start of the book, if you can do that with a history book, largely to keep it, well, a size that someday some publisher would actually publish. Kuropatkin is a interesting figure in that in 1898 he's considered the rising star of the army. But he's what the military would call a fast burner, so to speak, because by 1905 he is discredited, dishonored, and out of a job, essentially. But he does epitomize the military professionals that emerge in the early 20th century. And so where do they emerge from? Well, if we know anything at all about Russian history, I mean, you can go back and read Richard Helly's book on encirclement and military change, and you see this slow movement to where a professional officer corps emerges, and that they have one thing in common, and that's a military education. The quality of that education is something that I had to make an assessment on. And a lot of this book has, well, I'd say there's two chapters that are dedicated specifically to the type of education that a general staff officer would have had by, say, 1900. And the thing here is that this military educational process grows slowly in imperial history. You can date it back to the year 1730 when the Empress Anne opened up the first Cadet Corps Academy for the children of the nobility who supported her rise to power. And those Cadet Corps Academies become the establishment within the imperial regime that provides the basis of education for future Tsarist officers. And, what's going on after 1860 as a result of the Milyutin reforms is an effort to bring more men into these military educational institutions. In other words, what Milyutin establishes is the nobility can no longer provide 100% of the officers for the imperial army, because his ultimate goal, Milyutin's ultimate goal, is to create I guess for lack of a better term, a nation in arms. That is to train every draftable person in the empire to serve. The army's going to be bigger, it's going to need more officers, and the nobility is not going to be able to provide all of the officers. So there's this numbers issue. And that, I might add, is rooted deeply in the historiography, starting with a great Soviet historian named P.A. Zayachkovsky, who does a lot. He calls it the democratization of the army. And he demonstrates this slow-moving trend that boils down to, by the beginning of the 20th century, there's as many nobles as there are non-nobles in the imperial officer corps. And then inside that, some of these guys, allegedly the best and the brightest, are becoming general staff officers. Now, once you get inside the Imperial Nicholas Military Academy and study what's going on in there, the most amazing part of it for me was to realize that these guys still were taking Russian language classes because their Russian was so faulty that when they would write orders, and believe me, I've read these orders, they can't spell. And they have no penmanship. And it's really delightful on a cold day in Moscow trying to decipher this stuff. Okay, but I mean, this is the level of education that we're talking about. They are still, while their main focus is unquestionably studying strategy and operations, how to take an army onto a battlefield and do something with it. They're also still deeply embedded in studying small unit tactics. And by the time you get to the turn of the century in, say, Germany or France, this is not what general staff officers are doing at their academies. They're far more concerned about issues like military intelligence and war planning, which is going on in Russia. But it is not the only focus of their education. And that really is the point. When it came to the training issue, training was far more difficult for the Russian army to make work for itself. And the problem was that the parade ground where training happened was also where pass and reviews happened. And there could be no substantial war game in the Imperial Army without the pass and review. That is, the Tsar's military elite showing how spiffy they looked and how well they could march in formation. And I would argue that this really was the focus of training during the imperial period. This was a real difficult knot for me to untie because when you would read the assessments, the after-action reports, so to speak, the assessments always read, and they would have these individuals, observers, who would make these assessments. They were often members of the imperial family who would write these glowing reports about how great the army was. And I was there reading this stuff wondering, how can this army that's losing everything be so great? Something's missing here. And just to give you a brief aside of how research goes, when I was in Moscow, one of the things that I came to realize pardon me, was that a lot of officers, I thought, were going to France, particularly after the Russo-Japanese War, to study at the French Military Academy. And so I got some grant funds to spend the summer in Paris to read what they were doing in Paris. And, there's nothing wrong with being in Paris in the summer, except it gets a little hot after, say, the middle of July. And a funny thing happened on the way to the archive. I found out that there were a total of 2 officers who went to France and studied at the French Military Academy between 1898 and 1914. And then I stumbled, with the help of an archivist, on all of these reports written by French military attachés that were highly critical of the Imperial Army during war games and other such training maneuvers. Okay, so now I had something, I felt, that really was getting me closer to this army and understanding what their shortcomings were. And the real shortcoming is that when they would do a war game, the war game was for the Tsar. It was not for training purposes. And I think I lay that out plainly in the book through the text. So this leaves us with the question of performance. And conveniently, in the middle of the 1898 to 1914 period, occurs the Russo-Japanese War. And in studying that war, I actually came up with the central, let's call it, thrust of the book. And it boils down to this. Whose orders are you going to follow? Because there were actually three tracks that emerge in the Russo-Japanese War. There were the orders that were coming from Nicholas II and being carried out by various minions loyal to him. There were the orders that were being followed by, or being given by Kuropatkin, because he becomes commander-in-chief of the operational army and is out there as early as March 1904. And what also becomes really clear here is that officers in the field, and I don't know if we have any veterans here, but they literally would receive two sets of orders for how to proceed as they were going into battle. Now, anybody who knows anything about military establishments know that this isn't good at all. And what it caused was for officers in the field to decide, well, I can't please anybody, so I better please myself, which meant that they didn't always follow anybody's orders and went with their intuition, which may have been the smartest thing to do, but they never delivered a victory. It would have helped if there had been even a minor victory in this war for the army. So, what I like to dwell on is that when you're dealing with a set of orders coming from the Tsar, you're dealing with Russian tradition. When you're dealing with Kuropatkin, you're dealing with the tradition of reform. Okay, and as for the officers in the field, they're trying to survive. Okay, now, I am pleased to say that I just read the first review of the book last week, and it's not bad. I'll take it. Okay, you can find it in the Journal of Military History. The reviewer is Keith Nielsen, and he calls it a greasy pole. That is, there were two tracks that an officer could go up to try to reach the top of the army. You could either follow the Tsars contingent, and in the literature, that's usually referred to as guards officers. Or you could follow the professionals, who tend to be the general staff officers. But I want to be real careful here. History does not fall into neat little brackets. In fact, there were guards officers who were general staff officers. So you can't just simply say the nobility followed the Tsar to the end. In the end, these guys are making choices. They have to make a choice. They have to decide which side of the greasy pole they want to try to slip up. Okay? And so by the time you get to 1914, all of these guys are emerging professionals. There's no question about it. If you look at their careers, and you can do that in the appendix to my book, there you can see that once upon a time I got a degree in political science and had to learn how to crunch numbers. And so I put together a database which is a prosopographic study of the General Staff in 1914. And you can see where they went to school and how their career tracks followed and so forth. And what you find is that really General Staff officers are about 50-50 in terms of nobility versus non-nobility. And that these are the guys who probably have the best understanding of everything from the intellectual problems to the operational challenges that are going to confront them on the modern battlefield. But they have to operate within the societal bounds that are set by Nicholas II. And herein you find the hazards of everything we know about Nicholas II. So I like to tell my students he probably would have been a great insurance agent. But as a ruler of an empire, he just simply didn't have the capability. So I think I'll leave it there. I guess I could say that a book that inspired me and really helped set this thing up Still a great read is Solzhenitsyn's August 1914. You know, at the end of the book, it's a long book, of course, everything he wrote was long, but he brings you to this point where they're in East Prussia, and he's turning to this dilettante who represents the imperial suite, and he says, you guys blew it. Because, you know, these guys over here, these general staff officers, they knew what to do, but you guys blew it. And that sets the stage for Russia's Great War. So, thank you for coming, and I believe we
have plenty of time for questions. I'd like to get started, John, and kind of follow up on your question about these two tracks, the Tsars contingent and the so-designated professional officers. Mm-hmm. And I'm curious, in the process of professionalization, as they acquire these skills and kind of go to these separate schools and so forth, do they come up to, do they ever arrive to the opinion that the systems as simply is not working? Do they ever become politicized in the process of their training? Or is it simply that they're willing to exist within the bounds of this system and are busy trying to climb that greasy pole?
I was very fortunate in that on the question of if they become politicized, I was able to steer pretty much away from that. And the reason why is because it was done by an expert named William Fuller. A book that he published, well, I read in graduate school, and that was the 80s. And in that, he comes to the conclusion that, yes, they were politicized, but they all had to walk on, let's call it eggshells today. Because if you became too active, the next thing that was going to happen to your career was you were going to be somewhere in the empire, I guess we could call it a backwater, and you were going to go nowhere. But they were organizing into groups. And I think that's really Fuller's main point is that there were societies, they were getting together. A couple of them published very good journals with articles that I benefited from. The smart ones were getting together to promote the intellectual challenges that confronted all officers in the Army and wrote articles on it. And not surprisingly, a lot of those articles had to deal with technological issues. This was safe ground for them because there were limits to what they could do about the technological challenge. And those limits were not necessarily the Tsar and his anachronistic thinking as much as it was finance, the limits of what they could afford. And Fuller, once again, has a nice thick chapter on financing the Army. So, you know, in those cases, when we're circling down that road, I would lean heavily on the historiography because it wasn't my objective to write a 600-page book.
David.
It may be hard for you to distill an answer to this question out of the book, but your comment about the would have made a good insurance agent suggests a possible leaning. My question is, to what extent were the Tsar's perspective, his military perspectives, different from the General Staff's military perspectives? You know, advance, retreat, go left, go right. Could you give an example? And would it have made any difference? Would the Russians have done better against the Japanese if the professionals had been in charge as opposed to the whatever you want to call them?
Okay. I actually feel very comfortable answering this question because I think it's in the first chapter. I go into some depth and detail about Nicholas II's attitude towards the Army. And the Army was the one place where he felt secure. And the reason why he felt secure there was because he felt there were people there who were loyal to him. And so like every Romanov, he was commissioned when he was an infant into the Preobrazhensky Regiment. But he never took a rank higher than colonel, because he felt it would be disrespectful not only to the professionals, but also to the non-professionals who claimed themselves to be professionals. He recognized the difference, but we all know Nicholas II was an embattled Tsar. And as an embattled Tsar, he was suspicious of individuals who were, let's say in modern contemporary terms, too far out of the box. Okay, so he would not he would only go so far with the general staff officers. But what's really telling is in the midst of World War I, we know our World War I history in Russia. After the Great Retreat of 1915, Nicholas essentially fires the Grand Duke Nikolai Nikolaevich and appoints himself commander-in-chief of the army. He then gives effective command of the army to a general staff officer named Alexeyev, because he knew that he was no military commander. And Alexeyev was one of the brightest minds on the general staff. I think that tells us a lot. As far as your question about the Russo-Japanese War, would it have made a difference? That's a tough question. The issue there was the Tsars contingent and it's famously known, Nicholas II himself, had no respect for the Japanese and felt that the mere presence of the Imperial Army out there in Manchuria, the Liaodong Peninsula into Korea, would so intimidate Japanese soldiers that they would literally run for the hills. Kuropatkin didn't feel this way. Kuropatkin had toured Japan in the summer of 1903 and recognized them as a formidable foe. His plan was, it's going to take us up to 12 months to get the strength, the operational strength we need to Manchuria out there. So we shouldn't engage in any major combat until we get our forces out there and lined up. We'll just contain the Japanese until that moment. Now that sounds, well, maybe, they could have done something. But what you can't factor into a question like this is the Japanese army was not to be taken lightly, period. And when they went operational, they were going to be just as I want to say, as strong and as efficient as they proved to be in 1904. So I can't really answer that one for you.
Thomas.
My name's Thomas Grindley. 1914 was a very interesting year because Germany went to war with Russia. Do you have any information from German archives about Germany's assessment of the Russian army affecting their decision to go to war with Russia? Mm-hmm. Who were the negotiators at the time in Russian-German relations?
You want to know who the German negotiators were? Well, actually, I don't have any information for you. I can tell you this. I have not worked in the archives, and I have not done any diplomatic history on 1914, but I could direct you to a couple of sources that would answer your questions, I think. One of them was a dissertation done by a character named Oliver Griffiths. And Griffiths, I believe, was at Yale. I don't know. I'd have to double check. I'm pretty sure he was at Yale. And his whole dissertation is studying German military attachés and their attitudes towards Russia. And I read it in the course of actually revising this book. And I can't remember enough of the details now. But I remember sharply disagreeing with his conclusions. I think that he missed the point on the Army. But there is that type of archival research that I think you're looking for. On 1914 in negotiations, there are two things that are emerging here. One is the work by an individual named Bruce Menning, who has been all over the archive in Russia and is getting ready to publish a series of articles, if not a book. And you could contact him and probably get that information from him.
Right here.
In the 9 years after the settlement, the Portsmouth Treaty, and the start of the Great War, was there any organized effort at St. Petersburg to learn and to apply the lessons from the experience in the Russo-Japanese War?
Read chapters 5, 6, and 7. Most definitely. I mean, serious efforts, and I would say reformist elements were taken more seriously than ever. Even, I mean, the thrust of it really begins with a general staff officer named Martunov. And Martunov writes this book and says, actually, we need to reform this establishment on the same scope, same level as Miliutin did in the 1860s. And that's kind of where this reform movement takes off. From there, it goes to a cohort of progressive thinkers, general staff officers. The most famous one was Nikolai Nikolaevich Golovin. It's a name you might be familiar with because he does get stuff published in the West in the interwar period. And what they want to do is reorganize general staff training so it has relevance. And for them, relevance means linking general staff training very closely to conducting maneuvers during the spring, summer, and fall, and to do small-scale maneuvers in the hope that the Tsar would not show up. Because it was when the Tsar and his entourage showed up that you threw the manual out. And the manual became, we have to look good, and the Tsar side always wins. They understand this. They're trying to get over it. And my argument is that 9 years simply is not enough time.
Right here.
How effective were the general staff professionals in getting things like field artillery and machine guns deployed into the military, the divisions in the field?
Effectiveness is an interesting word to try to define. But one thing immediately comes to mind is one of the first war games, we'll call it, that occurs after 1905, actually occurs in the summer of 1906. There's a lot of debate whether or not they could even hold such a maneuver because the army still is suppressing rebellion around the empire. But nonetheless, they decide to have it. And I got a nice thick report. It proved to be the last report that the jewel of the French military attaches, a guy named Moulin, will write because he dies right after that. And he's making a big issue out of the fact that even after the Russo-Japanese War, where the Russians learned about doing a better job of concealing artillery, that they still had this problem of using powder that gave away positions from all the smoke. And by 1905, smokeless powder was out there. So they're still working on it, is what I would say is the proper answer. But let's remember, no matter how hard they tried to come up with a combined operational doctrine, in 1914, by September, they're running out of ammunition.
The only sweater right here.
Yeah, you, Michael.
We have a microphone coming your way.
Testing 1, 2, 3. I recently heard a presentation by Dominic Levin and immediately rushed out to buy his book on Russia's victory in the wars against Napoleonic France, which were arguably one of the great military success stories of history, certainly in Russian history, and which were, in a sense, the result of the best that the Russian administration, military administration, governmental support for the military administration could create. They were the fruit of a conservative order, and they confirmed Russian rulers in the reigns of Alexander, the subsequent reign of Alexander I and Nicholas I, in a conservative mindset. And now you have the result of what was a generation of liberal thinking and liberal reform that ultimately produced terrible failures. Mm-hmm. And my question is sort of open-ended, but I wonder if you have some reflections on the ironies that are involved. I mean, I can see profound differences between the situations, and yet the comparison is something that almost begs to be looked at.
Let's see if I ever invite you again. Well, reflections on you got to help me here, Michael. You got to form your question a little better. Do I do?
Does he address similar questions to yours?
Absolutely. You're asking me to compare my book to Lieven's book, sorta, kinda. Well, I'll put it to you like this: I'm only halfway through Dominic Lieven's book, and let me say that for all of the literature that's out there on Napoleon, nobody gets it the way he does, and I think it really does begin with this is a book rooted only in Russian sources. They do put together a military establishment, but you have to wonder how they pulled it off, how they pulled anything off when at the beginning of this book, when he's describing the administration of the Imperial Army, it's like it doesn't exist. Would you agree? Would you agree with that? Yeah, that's the way I read it. It's, literally a bunch of dilettantes working with the Tsar, whether you have the Tsar's favor, whether you don't have the Tsar's favor. These are all issues that fit into this equation. And Alexander I, in the course of this genuine national emergency, finally has to give up on the dilettantes and go with the military men. And I think that was a lesson that Nicholas I took from his cradle, that is as Tsar, December 14th, 1825, the Decembrist Revolt, to his grave. And Nicholas I is the one who comes up with, he's a maligned Tsar, I feel, because he's the guy who comes up with an administrative system that is essentially going to carry the regime until it collapses. And by an administrative system, I'm referring to the military alone. Okay, and we get to this moment where the liberals get their opportunity to reform the system. And they do a lot of good. There's no question about that. Miliutin does establish the capability of the regime to raise huge numbers of men to serve in the ranks. This is the nation in arms that he creates. But Russia is a big place. It's an unwieldy place. You don't need me to tell you this. And this becomes the real challenge for these guys here. They're often compared to German staff officers, which I feel is unfair. Germany, compared to Russia, is a neat and tidy country. And you understand its basic security threats at all times. The Russians had security threats coming at them in every direction. And the country was huge. Even after they decide, you could argue, at least 50 years too late to start building railways. They can't make those liberal reforms bear fruit because they don't have the technological infrastructure to pull it off. They do have the administrative structure, though.
Melissa.
Thank you. John, I wanted to come back to the timing question, but from a slightly different angle. And that is that we know from all of the work that's been published on German war planning that when they decide that they think a war with Russia is nearly inevitable, they decide sooner rather than later is good for them, in part because of Russia's grand military reform program that is underway. Mostly in the literature, that is, the assumption there is that the Germans are worrying about them rebuilding their fleet and their army after the debacle with Japan, and that they want to fight Russia before that happens. To what degree are they aware of changes in the general staff and the training? And from that angle, would you think that 5 more years would have made a big difference for Russia?
Well, do I think 5 more years would have made a big difference for Russia? No. And because the size of the empire was not going to change. Nicholas II was not going to change. They would have needed a leader of the the dynamic of somebody like Peter the Great. And it would have been done in typical Russian fashion, with a lot of hard labor at the expense of human capital. Now, the question on the Germans. I think that the Germans were very comfortable when they would look at their Russian adversaries. And by that I mean I don't think they viewed them as a personal threat. I think they very much feared the Russian steamroller, and being overwhelmed by, Russians coming down the chimney, as they experienced with Soviets in 1945. Once you got that machine rolling, there would be no stopping it. And it is true, the great reform plans that were, at least on paper in 1912, could have made a difference. But those great reform plans really don't make it off of paper. And still, and the Germans, I'm sure, were well aware that the whole debate around those reform plans in 1912 was whether or not to reinforce and build more fortresses or give them up in their western borderland. And that, that's one of those questions that was actually resolved by budgetary concerns. You have a pie, and so which piece is going to go where? So they started taking those fortresses apart. And that's what signals the fact that they're spending money elsewhere. But I think the Germans viewed that as greater opportunity for a war of maneuver on the Eastern Front, which is something that they don't have well thought out like they do in Western Europe. So I don't know if that answers it, but it's the best you're going to get at this moment.
Right here.
I wondered.
Microphone right behind you.
All right.
Thank you.
I have actually a couple of questions, if you'll forgive me. I was, since you spoke of the education of the general staff officers, I always have had a couple of sort of favorites I've wondered about. One of them is Mannerheim, and the other one is Rennenkampf. Mm-hmm. And I wondered if you could perhaps, if you studied them, say a couple of words about their education. And the second one is this. In light of the Russian defeat during the Russo-Japanese War, I wondered if the general staff or any movement was going on, a kind of a reconsideration of their alliance, the Entente Cordiale, mm-hmm. and perhaps a kind of caution that they might not be ready for when the big thing breaks, and that they might have perhaps reconsidered a rapprochement with Germany, or whether the general staff was too Francophile by that time. Thank you.
As for your individuals, I was just telling Will this morning. In '95, I was the Fulbright professor of Russian history at Helsinki University. And, of course, you can't go to Finland and say you're a Russian military historian without them wanting to include Mannerheim in the story. And the truth of the matter is that Mannerheim was not on the general staff. Okay, he was an operational officer and had a pretty interesting career, but he never went the general staff route. Now, von Rennenkampf did. He was a general staff officer, and I would put him in that group of reformers. And, he of course has this really bad rap, which is I think all wrong in the literature. And it comes from what I think, an event that I'm not even sure it happened, where Rennenkampf and Samsonov had words out in Manchuria over one failing to support the other. I think that may have been cooked up after the events of August 1914. The truth of the matter, as far as I am concerned, the truth according to Steinberg, is Rennenkampf marches into East Prussia. And he gets to Königsberg and he stops. He stops because he marched into East Prussia without his supply train intact. and he had nothing left until his supplies caught up to him. And the Germans understand this. A lot is made out of the fact that the Russians were, broadcasting in the open, uncoded messages. And my good friend Bruce Menning tells me that all of the armies in 1914, when they went operational, were doing that. That was not just a Russian thing. It just becomes a real big thing because evidently this is what tips off the Germans as to the fact that Rennenkampf has stopped and Samsonov is moving. But in actual fact, what tips off the German are really good reconnaissance assets. That is, their cavalry is out there and they've got their screen up and they know where the Russians are and what the Russians are doing. And so the German staff is able to respond accordingly. Now, nowhere have I seen any type of rapprochement towards the Germans after, at least among general staff officers, after 1905. Is that what you asked, after 1905?
Reconsideration of the power relationship.
I think that if there is any serious reconsideration, it's happening right at the top between, Willie and Nicky, and that whole story that is a part of the early 20th century relationship between cousins. Okay, but nowhere have I seen where the general staff officers are arguing we need some type of rapprochement with the Germans, because they really are linked to the French, not only from financial loans, but also, like I said, there was a reason why I thought there were a lot of Russian officers going to Paris, particularly between 1905 and 1914. And that was because what the progressive elements within the general staff who were trying to reform education and training, what they were looking at was the French model. That is what they're trying to adopt.
Any more questions? One last question then here for you, John. And I'm curious, as you talk about the rise of non-nobles in the Russian army, to what are the social background of these non-nobles? Are they Germans? Are they people from within inside the empire? Is there social mobility kind of coming from the bottom ranks of Russian society, working their way to the top? Where do these non-nobles come from? And
well, the most famous case is that of General Denikin of Civil War fame. General Denikin's father was a serf. Okay, but Nicholas I again makes it viable for the children of serfs who served in the army for their children to receive a military education, not a cadet corps education. That would be far too extravagant and fancy, but one where they were educated within the regiment that they were posted to. And this became a way for people. And so literally you have these guys coming from all social ranks, and it is a form of social mobility for them. But they are never going to be accepted by somebody who went, for example, to the Corps of Pages, the elite school for Tsarist military servitors.
well, I'd like to thank John for his very interesting talk. The book is on sale outside, and John is happy to sign any copies. And thank you very much for coming, and we look forward to you at future Kennan Institute events. Thanks very much.